I have told this story to no one. Not to my wife, not to my chaplain, not to the long succession of gentlemen who have sat across from me at one club or another, swirling brandy and asking how my brother came to be the one man in England who married for love when every odd was against it. I have smiled and changed the subject. Some things deserve a better audience than a club dining room. Some things deserve to be told once properly by someone who was there. My name does not matter. I am the younger brother of the Duke of Halvenmere, and that is all the introduction this account requires. I was present at the auction. I was present at the estate. I watched what grew in that cold house through one of the hardest winters the county had endured in 30 years, and I watched my brother, a man who had gone through life behind a wall of iron and deliberate distance, crack open slowly, like a frost-sealed door when spring is finally decided. I watched the woman who did it, and I have not forgotten a single morning of it. Let me begin at the auction. It was held in the back room of Harwell's, which passed itself off as a solicitor's office on the ground floor, and conducted a good deal of uglier business on the upper floors when the occasion demanded. The occasion that November was the liquidation of Lord Fenwick's affairs. Lord Fenwick, Alara's father, had borrowed against everything he possessed, mortgaged Fenwick House twice over, borrowed against the mortgage, and then borrowed against that. And when the final creditor called his notes in the same week that the harvest failed and the timber merchant refused to extend credit, there was nothing left. Nothing except the house, already pledged, the furniture, already catalogued, and one unmarried daughter of 22. The law of the time was a convenient thing if you were a creditor. A gentleman could not be sent to debtor's prison if a suitable arrangement could be made, and a suitable arrangement, in the understanding of the men who gathered in Harwell's back room that morning, meant the daughter, a marriage. A husband who would assume the debts, clear the books, and restore whatever shred of Fenwick credit could be salvaged. The daughter had no say in the matter in any legal sense. The creditors held the notes. The solicitors had drawn up the papers. All that remained was to find a buyer. I had come with my brother because he had asked me to come, and because Halvenmere rarely asked me for anything. He sat beside me in that room, 12 men arranged on chairs that smelled of old paper and older anxieties, and he looked at nothing in particular with the expression he had worn since he was 19 years old, when our father died and left him the title and the estate, and the debts of our own that no one outside the family knew about. The expression was not coldness, exactly. It was the face of a man who had decided, long ago, that allowing himself to be visibly moved was a luxury he could not afford. He had come, he told me in the carriage, because Fenwick's eastern parcels adjoined Halvenmere's northern wood, and he meant to acquire them if the price was sensible. He had not come for the other matter. He made that clear. I believed him. He had never given me reason not to. The solicitor opened the proceedings with a cough and a sheaf of papers, and a great deal of legal language that amounted to the following. Lord Fenwick's debts were considerable. The assembled creditors were owed in total the sum listed on page 4 of the documents, and the matching of a suitable husband, one willing to assume the full debt in exchange for the hand of Miss Fenwick and such properties as were not already pledged, would discharge the matter entirely. Then the door at the back of the room opened, and she came in. I had expected, I do not know what I had expected, something crushed perhaps, something that looked like what the situation was, a woman sold. I had expected frightened eyes and a dress chosen to make her palatable, and the sort of desperate composure that is really only terror wearing a different coat. What came through that door was something else entirely. She was not beautiful in the way the word is usually meant. She was slight, with dark hair arranged simply without ornament, and a face that was all quiet planes and steady eyes. She was wearing a gray dress, good wool, well made but plainly cut, and she wore it as if it were a queen's gown. She walked to the chair they had set out for her in the center of the room, facing the assembled men, which was the cruelest placement I could imagine, and she sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. And then she looked at the room. Not pleadingly. not with the performance of dignity that is secretly begging. She simply looked, and in looking she seemed to take in every face in that room with a calm that said she had already decided whatever was going to happen here was not going to break her. It might cost her, but it was not going to break her. My brother went still. I know him too well to have missed it. It was not dramatic, no caught breath, no visible stiffening. It was more the absence of the slight constant motion that men carry with them without knowing, the small restlessness of a body waiting for something. He went entirely still, the way a hunting dog does when the bird is suddenly, unmistakably, exactly there. The solicitor cleared his throat. Miss Fenwick, 22 years of age, accomplished, no encumbrances. The full terms of the arrangement are as listed. Accomplished. The word hung in the room like an insult dressed in courtesy, and every man there knew it. One of the creditors, a heavy-set man in a waistcoat that had seen better years, said, without troubling himself to lower his voice, "What's the floor? She's plain and penniless. I wouldn't offer a sovereign." There was a ripple through the room. Not laughter, exactly. The sound men make when they agree with something they know they shouldn't say aloud and are grateful someone else said it first. She did not move. She did not blink. She sat in that chair in the center of the room, and she looked at the heavy-set man, and the expression on her face was the most extraordinary thing I had ever seen in my 28 years of watching the world. She was not hurt. She was not pretending not to be hurt. She simply was not. She had already been through the part of this that could hurt her, some private reckoning she had conducted alone, in her room or in her garden or in the dark of some earlier night, and she had come out the other side of it, and what this room had to offer was nothing she hadn't already absorbed. The solicitor said uncomfortably, "The floor is 1 sovereign as discussed." My brother said, £10,000. The room turned to look at him. I turned to look at him. The solicitor blinked so hard his spectacles shifted. Halvenmere had not changed his posture. He was still sitting in the same slight angle of ease he had maintained since we arrived, one arm along the back of the adjacent chair, his gaze directed now at the solicitor with the particular quality of attention that meant he was done waiting for someone to catch up. £10,000, he said again, as if the room had simply not heard him. To assume the full debt and whatever peripheral obligations Lord Fenwick has incurred that are not yet listed. I want all of it cleared. I will have my solicitor here within the hour. He paused. The eastern parcels to Halvenmere land are included, as discussed. The heavy-set man said, "I beg your pardon, the floor was 1 sovereign." "I know what the floor was," Halvenmere said, with a quiet that was more final than any volume. "I have named a different figure." The room did not know what to do with itself. I did not know what to do with myself. I looked at my brother's profile, the hard, familiar lines of him, the jaw set in that way it had when he had decided something and considered the decision already made, and then I looked at the girl. She was looking at him. And for the first time since she had walked through that door her composure had shifted, not broken, not remotely, but shifted. There was something moving behind those steady eyes, something that was trying to understand what had just happened, and was not yet ready to name it anything. The solicitor recovered himself. "The sum is yes, accepted. The documentation will require." "I know what documentation it will require," Halvenmere said. "My solicitor will attend to it, Miss Fenwick." He stood. He looked at her briefly and directly without performing anything. "The carriage is outside. You may take whatever you have packed." She stood. She was very straight. "I have packed 1 trunk," she said, and her voice was the clearest thing in that room, "and my mother's writing desk." "Then they will both be loaded," he said. And he walked out, and after a moment she followed, and I gathered my hat and coat and trailed after both of them into the November cold, feeling very strongly that I had just watched something begin that I did not have the language for yet. Halvenmere Hall was 3 hours' drive north. through countryside that turned from merely gray to magnificently gray as we climbed, the fields giving way to moorland, and the sky pressing down in that particular way it has in the north when winter has decided it is done, merely threatening and means to stay. The carriage was large and well appointed, and my brother sat on one side and Miss Fenwick on the other, and I sat beside my brother, feeling considerably in the way. They did not speak for the first hour. This was not uncomfortable, which was itself remarkable. My brother was not a man who filled silences with anything, and most people, placed opposite him in a closed carriage, spent the time either trying to fill the silence themselves or becoming visibly distressed by it. Miss Fenwick did neither. She looked out the window. She looked at her hands. Once she looked at him directly, with that same quality of quiet assessment, and when he met her gaze, which he did, without pretense, she simply nodded, as if she had confirmed something she had already suspected. I thought, she is going to be all right. Whatever this is, she is going to be all right. We passed through 2 villages and a market town. At the market town, the coachman stopped to water the horses, and we sat in the stationary carriage for 10 minutes while the town went about its business around us. And it was during this pause that I first observed the thing that I came to think of, over the weeks that followed, as her particular quality of attention. A woman crossed the street outside the window with a basket on one arm and a child pulling at the other, and Miss Fenwick watched them with the same completeness she had brought to every other thing she had looked at that day. Not the vague looking out that is really looking inward, not the performance of interest, but genuine curiosity, as if the woman and the child were worth understanding on their own terms. The child tripped on the cobbles, and the woman caught him without slowing, without looking, by the precise instinct of someone who has done this 1,000 times, and Miss Fenwick smiled. A small smile, private, not meant for anyone, but I was sitting diagonally across and I saw it. I looked at my brother. He had seen it too. He was looking at the side of her face with the expression I was beginning to think of as the stillness, and in that expression there was something I had not seen in him in a very long time, something that was less than certainty and more than curiosity. It was the look of a man who has set eyes on a country he did not know existed and is trying to determine whether the roads are passable. The carriage moved on. She turned from the window. She saw him looking, and she did not, to my relief, perform any version of being caught or being studied. She simply met his gaze, level and without drama, and then looked at the road ahead as if she had simply confirmed what she already knew and had no particular objection to it. My brother said, at the end of the first hour, without preamble, "I will not require anything of you that you do not wish to give." She turned from the window. I understood the terms. "The terms," he said, "are what was written. I am telling you what I intend, which is a separate matter." She considered this. Then she said, "You paid £10,000. "Yes." "For land?" He said nothing. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the window. "I see," she said quietly, and the words carried something careful in them, something that was not suspicion and was not yet trust, but was perhaps the space where trust might eventually build if it was given time and reason. I looked at my brother. He was looking at the road ahead, and his face was doing the thing it rarely did, which was nothing at all, not the deliberate neutral he usually wore, but a genuine blankness, as if the machinery that usually managed his expression had briefly stalled. I thought, well, this is something. The hall received her as great houses receive people they haven't been told to expect, correctly and without warmth. The housekeeper, Mrs. Farron, a capable woman who had worked for our family since before I was born, assigned her the best guest rooms in the East Wing, Halvenmere's instruction, given quietly on the steps before we came inside, and saw that a fire was lit and a tray sent up. The staff were professional. They were not unkind. They were, as yet, uncertain of what exactly this woman was to the Duke, and staff in a great house are very good at reflecting uncertainty back at you until they have been told what to think. I know because Mrs. Farron told me weeks later. She was not a woman given to gossip, but she was a woman who noticed things and occasionally found them worth reporting. That Miss Fenwick came down to breakfast the next morning at 7:30, which was earlier than anyone in the house expected her, and she had brought a small book, and she had sat in the breakfast room and eaten what she was given and read, and when the footman came to clear, she had thanked him by name, though she had only learned the name the previous evening. Mrs. Farron said, "She asked me that first morning whether there was anything that needed doing. Not to be helpful, you understand, to know. She wanted to understand the house." I asked what Mrs. Farron had said to her. Mrs. Farron said she had told her about the state of the stillroom stores and the question of the linen inventory that had been wanting attention since autumn, and Miss Fenwick had listened carefully and asked 2 or 3 precise questions, and then said she would be glad to assist if that was useful. And Mrs. Farron, who had prepared herself, I think, for a difficult adjustment, found herself handing over the linen inventory before she had quite decided to do it. "She didn't take it," Mrs. Farron said. "She didn't move to take my place. She just helped, as if she understood exactly where the line was and didn't need to be shown it." This was, I came to understand, characteristic. She was not passive, she was not subservient. She had a clear and practical intelligence about what was hers to manage and what was not, and she operated inside that understanding without either resentment or the performance of graciousness. She simply did the work, and the work was good. My brother's mother was another matter. The Dowager Duchess of Halvenmere had retired to the dower house on the grounds 3 years prior, when my brother had made it clear, with characteristic directness, that he preferred to manage his own household. She visited frequently, was received with the full courtesy her position warranted, and had opinions about everything her elder son did that she expressed at length, at volume, and without invitation. She appeared at dinner on the second evening, having been informed of Miss Fenwick's presence by whatever network of intelligence she had maintained since the Napoleonic era, and she sat at the table and looked at the girl with the particular expression that dowager duchesses reserve for things they intend to remove. "Miss Fenwick," she said, in the voice of someone reading a charge sheet, "I understand your father's affairs were rather badly managed." "Yes," Alara said. She had been given a place at the table that acknowledged her position, whatever her position currently was, and she sat in it with the same straight-backed ease she had brought to the chair at Harwell's. "They were. And you had no hand in that?" "None." The dowager looked at her son. "I had assumed, when you said you had business at Harwell's, that you meant land." "I acquired the eastern parcels," Halvenmere said. "Among other things." She set down her wine glass with a precision that was itself a statement. "I see." Alara looked at the dowager without flinching. She looked at the table between them. She picked up her own glass and drank from it with a composure that was so complete it was, I realized, a kind of eloquence. She was not performing patience. She was simply not giving the dowager the satisfaction of watching her react. Halvenmere watched this exchange from his end of the table. His expression was the composed public one. But I was watching his hands, which rested on the table lightly, and I saw them still, the same stillness I had noticed at Harwell's, when Alara set her glass down without a tremor. I filed it away. The weeks that followed were a study in how 2 very careful people occupy a house together, when neither of them has been told what, exactly, they are to each other. She learned the house quickly. She did not interfere with Mrs. Farron's management of it, but she asked questions, good questions, the kind that meant she was paying attention, and Mrs. Farron, who had no patience for women who did not pay attention, began to answer them with increasing detail. She walked the grounds in the morning, even as November became December and the cold turned serious. The staff noted this, and noted that she thanked them by name, and noted that she did not treat the hall as a stage on which she was performing the role of the Duke's wife, but rather seemed genuinely curious about how the place worked and the people in it. I was there for most of it. I had intended to stay a week. I stayed 4. I told myself it was the weather. The roads were genuinely bad, but the truth was that I did not want to leave before I understood what I was watching. My brother worked. He had always worked the estate, the investments, the correspondence that came in bags from London 3 days a week, the land management, the legal affairs. He was very good at it. He was, I think, the only man I had ever known who found more ease in the management of great complexity than in any room full of people, and who had built a life accordingly. He worked in his study in the mornings, rode the northern quarter of the estate in the afternoons regardless of the weather, and ate dinner with whatever company was present without, it seemed, feeling the need to make the dinner anything other than what it was. He began, after the first week, to take a different route on his afternoon rides. The route took him past the south kitchen garden, where Alara had taken to spending an hour in the late afternoon, ostensibly to inspect the winter plantings, which Mrs. Farron had admitted were in need of some reorganization. She had her coat pulled close and a basket she had found somewhere, and she moved among the frost-killed beds with the attentiveness of someone who knew what she was looking at. He did not stop the first time. He rode past. I happened to be at the window and I happened to see it. He did not slow his horse exactly, but there was a moment, a very brief moment, in which the horse might have slowed of its own accord and found no correction from its rider, and Halvenmere rode on. The next day the route took him past the garden again. The day after that he stopped. I did not hear what was said. I was at a considerable distance, and the wind was up. I saw him dismount, which was unexpected. I saw him stand beside her in the garden with his coat dark against the pale winter light, and she showed him something in one of the beds, a plant, some particular arrangement of the soil, and he looked at what she was showing him with attention, not the performed attention of a man making conversation, the genuine article. They stood there for perhaps a quarter of an hour. Then he mounted again and rode on, and she went back to her basket. At dinner that evening, she mentioned, without emphasis, that the south garden's drainage channel was blocked and would flood the beds come spring thaw if not addressed. He said he would have Fenton, the groundskeeper, attend to it. She said she thought it was a matter that would take 3 men and a clear frost. He said he would have Fenton take 3 men. This exchange lasted perhaps 2 minutes. I watched my brother's face through all of it, and it did not change. But his eyes, which rarely stayed on anyone for long, stayed on her for the full 2 minutes and then a fraction longer. I thought, here it is. Whatever this is going to be, here is where it begins. My brother began, in those weeks, to do something I had not seen him do in all the years I had known him. He began to explain things. Not in the instructional way, not in the way of a man demonstrating his own knowledge to a captive audience. In the way of a man who has decided that a particular person's understanding of a particular thing matters to him, who wants them to see what he sees, because their seeing it will make it more real. He showed her the estate accounts, not because she had asked, though she would have asked eventually. The question was already forming behind those careful eyes every time she moved through a room and assessed what it contained. He brought them one afternoon to the morning room, where she had established herself at the small table by the window with the household receipt book and a pot of cold tea, and he set the accounts ledger on the table beside the receipt book without ceremony and said, "I thought you would want to understand where we are." She looked at him. Then she looked at the ledger. "Yes," she said, and pulled the chair nearer the table. They spent 3 hours on it that afternoon. She was quick with figures, quicker than he had expected. He told me much later, and she asked about the tenants by name. She asked about the timber contracts and the reason the rates had fallen in the previous 2 seasons. She asked about a line in the household column that represented the east wing repairs that had been deferred, and when he explained the deferral she said, practically, "If it's deferred another season it will cost 3 times as much." He said he knew. She said, "Then we should address it in spring." We, the word without emphasis, the most natural pronoun in the sentence. He did not remark on it. But his expression, for a moment, was the one I had been learning, the stillness that was not emptiness but its opposite. She was also reading. She had found the library in the first week, and had moved through it with the systematic pleasure of someone who has been kept from a good supply for some time and means to make up the deficit. She did not choose fashionably. She took the agricultural treatises and the county histories and the collected observations of a naturalist who had spent 3 decades walking the moorlands north of us, and she read them in the mornings before the household required her attention, and in the evenings she occasionally asked him a question about something she had read that was specific and careful, and not at all the kind of question designed to draw him out. It was the kind of question you ask when you genuinely want to know the answer. He always answered, and then almost always he asked a question of his own. Christmas came to Halvenmere the way it always had, which was to say with a great deal of organization and very little spontaneity. My brother did not dislike Christmas, but he approached it as he approached most things, as a problem with known parameters that could be managed if one was systematic. The hall was dressed. The tenants received their customary gifts. A dinner was held for the local families of standing. The dowager came for the full week of it, which was her right and her tradition, and she brought with her a house guest, Miss Pemberton, the daughter of the Earl of Callaway, and by any measure that the dowager applied, everything that Alara was not. Beautiful, conspicuously so, in the way that had been described as a talent from her infancy. Well-connected, in possession of a portion that would have comfortably serviced Fenwick's debts twice over. And unmarried, which the dowager had clearly decided, was a condition that could be remedied if she arranged the right dinner. She had not, to my knowledge, informed my brother of her plan. She had simply, as was her style, created the circumstances and waited for nature to take its course. The dinner was the 23rd of December. 8 at table, my brother, the dowager, Miss Pemberton, Miss Pemberton's mother, myself, the Reverend Ashby and his wife, and Alara. The dowager had arranged the seating. Miss Pemberton was placed at Halvenmere's right. Alara was placed at the far end beside the Reverend, which was a kindness to neither of them, though the Reverend was, in fairness, a perfectly agreeable man. Miss Pemberton was charming. She was genuinely charming, not the performance of it. She asked my brother questions, and listened to his answers and laughed at something he said with a real laugh. And she was lovely and warm and clearly understood what this dinner was meant to accomplish, and was not opposed to it. My brother was courteous. He was always courteous. He asked her questions in return, he attended to her answers, he refilled her wine when it was needed. But I noticed, and I was watching closely, that twice during the first course his gaze moved, without apparent intention, to the far end of the table, where Alara was talking to the Reverend with a composed attentiveness that was, it occurred to me, the same quality she had brought to the south kitchen garden. She was genuinely curious about what the Reverend had to say. The dowager noticed my brother's glance. I saw her notice it. Her eyes went to Alara and then to her son, and then her expression arranged itself into something that was very nearly satisfaction, but was in fact its opposite. The satisfaction of someone who has confirmed a problem they were already planning to solve. After dinner, after the Reverend and his wife had gone home, after Miss Pemberton's mother had retired, after I had been very deliberately occupied by the dowager in a long and unnecessary discussion about the north wing plasterwork, I heard, from the corridor outside the drawing-room, my brother's mother speak. She said in a voice designed to carry, "You cannot seriously intend to continue this arrangement, Halvenmere. You acquired her in a commercial transaction. There is no shame in acknowledging that it need not be permanent. Miss Pemberton's interest is clear. Her connections are impeccable. The girl," and this pause was pointed, "is a debt instrument, nothing more." I stopped in the corridor. I could not see into the room. I could hear perfectly. My brother said nothing for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Where is she?" The dowager said, "I beg your pardon." "Miss Fenwick," he said, "where is she at this moment?" There was a pause. Then the dowager said in a different tone, less certain, as if she had misjudged the ground, "She retired after dinner. I believe she said something to Mrs. Farron about—" "She retired," he said, "because she recognized what this dinner was and chose not to ask me to witness it from a better seat." A pause. "That is not the behavior of a debt instrument." The dowager began to say something. My brother said, quietly and with finality, "I will not have this conversation again." I heard her leave. I pressed myself against the wall of the corridor, which was undignified, and waited. After a moment I heard him cross the room, heard the door to the hallway open, heard his footsteps going, not toward the staircase in his study, but toward the east wing. I stood in that corridor for a very long time. He did not tell me what happened next. He has never told me. What I know is what Alara told me later, when she had become the kind of friend who tells things, and I will tell it as she told it, in the knowledge that she permitted me to carry it. She had not, in fact, retired. She had gone as far as the small sitting room at the end of the east wing corridor, the one with the window that looks out over the moor, and she had sat in the chair by the cold fireplace. She had not rung for a fire because she was not sure, even now, which things she was permitted to ask for, and she had been very still and very honest with herself in the way that she had learned to be. She had looked at the evening and she had named what it had felt like. The long table with the lovely girl at one end and herself at the other, and the knowledge that the dowager had arranged this, and the further knowledge, the harder one, that she had no standing to object to any of it because she was, in the terms of the document that had brought her here, an arrangement, not a wife. Not yet. She had not cried. She had decided, some time before the dinner, that she was not going to cry. But she had sat in the dark of that room and permitted herself to feel, fully, what the situation was, because she had learned that the only way to keep her head was to be honest about what was in it. The knock at the door was light. She thought it was Mrs. Farron with the evening candle. She said, "Come in." He came in. He had a candle himself already lit, and he carried it with the slight awkwardness of a man unaccustomed to carrying candles, because there are always people to do it for him. He stopped inside the doorway and looked at her sitting in the dark and said, "You didn't ring for a fire." She said, "I wasn't sure I should." He crossed to the fireplace and crouched and did the thing himself, which surprised her. She had not thought he knew how, though this was probably an unfair assumption. And when the fire caught and the light rose, she saw his face more clearly than she had yet seen it, the hard, clear planes of it, and the expression on it, which was not any of the ones she had catalogued over the preceding weeks. It was, she told me, a face stripped down to something it had been hiding. He stayed crouching by the fire for a moment after it caught. Then he looked at her. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You don't," she said. "I do." He stood. He stood the way he always stood, which was as if the room was just slightly too small for him, not because of his height, though he had that, but because of the weight of him, the gravity he seemed to carry. "I did not bring you here because of the land." She waited. "I am not certain," he said, with the precision of a man who has spent considerable time determining exactly how to say what he means without overstating it, "that I can explain to you what happened when you walked into that room. I am not certain I can explain it to myself. I know that I looked at you and I knew, immediately, without reasoning, that whatever that room was going to do to you, I did not want it done." Alara said, very quietly, "That is a very large sum to spend on not wanting something done." "I am aware." He looked at the fire, then he looked at her. "The arrangement, as written, is what it is. I will not hold you to it if you find, in time, that it is not what you want. I would rather tell you that now before we are any further in." A pause that was, she told me, the longest she had ever heard from him. "But I want you to know that I brought you here knowing what I was bringing you into, and I intend to deserve it, whatever that requires." She looked at him for a long time. She was 22, and she had been through a great deal in a short stretch of months, and she was sitting in a chair by a fire that a duke had lit for her in a room she hadn't dared to ring for warmth in, and what he had just said to her was not what she had expected from any direction. She said, "Then we had better start." He said, "Yes," and then, after a moment, "I don't know your name, your given name. The solicitor's documents had only Miss Fenwick." She told him. He said it back to her once quietly, as if learning the shape of it, and then he nodded and said good night and left. She sat by the fire until it burned low, and she did not feel like a dead instrument. January. The Dowager left after Christmas and did not return until spring, which was, my brother had communicated, the preferable arrangement. Miss Pemberton went with her. The hall settled back into its rhythms, but they were different rhythms now, recalibrated, as if a piece of furniture that had always been slightly wrong in a room had been moved, almost imperceptibly, to where it had always wanted to be. I rode out one morning with Halvenmere to inspect the drainage work on the south garden, which Fenton and his men had completed the week before. Ilara came with us. She walked the trench line with Fenton and asked him about the depth of it and whether the fall was sufficient, and Fenton, who had a great deal of pride and not much patience, answered her questions with something that had become, over the past weeks, genuine respect. She knew what she was asking. She had read, it turned out had read widely and carefully, on subjects most women of her station were not expected to have opinions about, and this was one of them. My brother watched her with Fenton. He did not disguise it. He had, I noticed, stopped disguising things in her vicinity, not because he had become careless, but because, I thought, he had decided she was worth the risk of being legible too. On the ride back she said to him, "Fenton thinks the Northwood drainage wants the same attention." Halvenmere said, "Fenton is right. I've been meaning to address it for 2 seasons." She said, "I looked at it yesterday morning. I think I know what's causing it." He looked at her, not the brief registering glance, the full attention. "Tell me." She told him. She was precise and practical, and she had clearly stood in the North Wood in January in the cold and paid attention to the problem. And he listened with the quality of listening that meant he was hearing every word and also, at the same time, thinking several steps ahead of it. Then he said, "When did you look at it?" She said, "Yesterday. I walked out after breakfast." He said, "The temperature was below freezing yesterday morning." She said, "Yes." He said, "You should have had someone go with you. The Northwood footing is uncertain in hard frost." She looked at him. He looked back, and something crossed between them in that look, something that was not quite said but was entirely communicated, something that had the shape of, "I notice when you are not here, and I would prefer that you not come to harm." She said mildly, "I will take Jenks next time." He said, "I will come myself." I rode slightly ahead of them after that and looked at the horizon and did not smile, which was very difficult. February brought a thaw and then a refreezing, and then a snow that lasted 9 days and kept us all inside. It was during those 9 days that I understood the thing had become, quietly and without either of them making a declaration of it, something real. They read in the same room in the evenings. This had begun as accident and continued as choice. The library was the warmest room in the north-facing half of the hall, and on the second evening of the snow he had been working there when she came in to find a particular volume she had asked Mrs. Farron about, and he had known where it was, on the upper shelf, 3rd from the left, the section that held the agricultural records alongside, incongruously, a row of French philosophy that my father had collected and my brother had read and I had never touched. She had wanted the agricultural records. He had found them. She had taken the chair by the secondary lamp, not the better chair near the fire, which was his, and she had read, and he had returned to his papers, and they had spent the evening in a silence that was not empty. The next evening she came again. This time she came earlier, and by the 4th evening it was simply what the evenings were, The library, the two lamps, the fire, his papers, and her book, and occasionally, tentatively, a conversation about whatever she was reading that became, as the snow days accumulated, longer and less tentative. He had books she wanted. She had opinions about them that he found. This was visible, surprising, and then engaging, and then, I thought, necessary in the way that a well-directed argument is necessary to a mind that has been conducting its arguments alone for too long. She pushed back. She did not push back to provoke, and she did not capitulate to preserve the peace. She simply said what she thought, with the particular care of someone who had thought about it, and waited to hear what he thought, and then engaged with what he actually said rather than with what she had expected him to say. On the fourth evening she disagreed with him about the management of enclosed common land, and she did so clearly with evidence, and he sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that was, for him, practically open. He said, "Where did you read that?" She told him the pamphlet, a piece from a reformist quarterly that she had found in her father's library before everything was sold. He said he had the same one somewhere, and he found it, and they sat for an hour with it between them, and the conversation that followed was the kind that happens only between two people who are both genuinely surprised by the other's mind, and not trying to conceal that surprise. He had not, I believe, encountered this before. Not from someone he was also watching with that quality of suspended stillness. Not from someone who could look at the south garden drainage and the north wood footing and the dowager's dinner arrangement, and understand all three with the same clear-eyed attention, and not be diminished by any of them. There was an evening, the 6th day of the snow, the fire high, a wind finding all the gaps in the north-facing windows, when she set her book down and said, to no one in particular, "My mother used to say that the wind in a house tells you what the house is thinking." He looked up from his papers. He said, "What is it thinking tonight?" She considered. "That it's been cold for a long time," she said, "and that it would like not to be." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at his papers, but his hand, which rested on the desk, had stopped moving. "I went to bed early. I thought they deserved the room." March. The dowager returned, as threatened with the spring. She had spent the winter months in London, which had given her an audience for her opinions and the opportunity to circulate a version of events that cast the situation at Halvenmere as a temporary arrangement entered into for reasons of land and business that would, she was confident, be resolved by summer. She arrived with a new house guest, a widowed cousin in need of somewhere to stay, perfectly agreeable, and the air of someone who has spent 3 months preparing a second attempt. She did not go at Alara directly. She had learned, perhaps, that direct approaches did not work. She went at the situation. She rearranged the guest rooms so that the widowed cousin occupied the best rooms in the east wing. She organized a series of visitors who required the sitting room in the east wing corridor, which meant Alara had nowhere particular to be in the evenings that was distinctly her own. She made small, precise decisions that cumulatively reduced Alara's footprint in the house, not cruelly enough for my brother to object to any one instance, but consistently enough that the cumulative weight was unmistakable. Alara bore it with the composure that was her signature. She moved around the rearrangements. She adapted. She found the morning room and made that her base, and the morning room was smaller and less pleasant, and she made something of it anyway, because she was the sort of person who makes something of the room she is given. I watched my brother watch this. He saw it. He had always seen things. It was, in fact, one of his most uncomfortable qualities, the degree to which he observed and filed and said nothing until he was ready to say something definitive. He watched his mother's campaign unfold across a fortnight, and he said nothing, and Alara asked nothing of him, and the whole thing had the quality of a tide coming in. On the 14th day of March, a Friday, I was in the library when I heard a carriage in the drive and then voices in the entry, and then the sound of the dowager greeting another set of visitors, unexpected or unexpected to me, and then footsteps going toward the drawing room. I heard from the drawing room the dowager say, in the particular carrying tone she used for public statements, "Miss Pemberton has been good enough to call on her way north. Halvenmere, you will remember Miss Pemberton." I set my book down. I heard my brother say, "Good afternoon, Miss Pemberton," with exact courtesy. I heard the visit begin, the greetings, the arrangement of chairs, the tea being ordered. I heard the dowager steer the conversation, smoothly and without appearing to steer, toward the season ahead, the events planned in London, the suitability of the hall for a certain kind of life, all of it designed to say, without saying it, "This is what you could have, and it is available." I heard, after perhaps 20 minutes of this, the door from the east corridor open. Alara came in. She had been, I learned later, in the morning room when the carriage arrived and had come to the drawing room through the connecting corridor, which meant she had passed the open doorway and seen the tableau before she entered. She had made, in the space of that passage, a decision, and she came in with her hands still and her chin level, and she said good afternoon to Miss Pemberton with the warmth of genuine courtesy, and she took the one remaining chair, which the dowager had not reserved for her, and she sat in it. The dowager watched this with an expression I had never seen on her face before, the beginning of uncertainty. Miss Pemberton was gracious, she always was. She said something pleasant to Alara about the grounds. She had seen them through the carriage window. They were very fine, and Alara responded with particular and specific knowledge about the south garden, the work that had been done on the drainage, the plans for the spring beds, and Miss Pemberton listened with genuine interest and said, "You know it very well." "I live here," Alara said, simply and without challenge. 3 words. The dowager's expression shifted again. My brother had been standing by the fireplace. He had been watching the room with the quality of stillness I knew now in my bones, the one that meant he was at the exact threshold between the decision forming and the decision made. He looked at Alara, and then he looked at his mother, and then he crossed the room. He did not do it dramatically. He did not clear the room or make a speech. He crossed to where Alara was sitting and he stood beside her chair, and the standing there, the simple fact of him there, beside her, in the geometry of the room, said everything that needed to be said without a word of it spoken. The dowager looked at her son. He looked back, and his expression, his careful, managed, lifelong expression, had released something, not anger, not defiance, something quieter and more absolute, the look of a man who has decided without drama and without apology what his life is and has placed himself in it. He said, to the room but meaning one particular person in it, "I would like to show Miss Fenwick the East Gallery, if you will excuse us." She rose, she went with him. They left the room together, and behind them the dowager sat in her chair with her teacup and her house guest and Miss Pemberton, who was perfectly gracious and clearly understood, now, the shape of things. The East Gallery was long and poorly lit in the afternoon, and smelled of old canvas, and the particular cold that settles into rooms where the fires are not regularly lit. He lit the nearest lamp himself, as he had lit the fire in the East Wing sitting room that December night, and the light came up slowly over the long rows of painted faces that lined the walls. She stood beside him and looked at them. "They all look very serious," she said. "They were very serious people," he said. "We have been serious for 11 generations." A pause. "I have been told this is a failing." She looked at him, the lamp between them. "No," she said, "it is not a failing, it is how you carry things." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I should have told you before now what you are to me." He stopped. He was not, it was clear, accustomed to this, not the sentiment which she had perhaps intuited, but the language of it, the exposure of it, the putting of it into words where it could be looked at and found insufficient. "I find I have a significant number of words for every other subject." She said quietly, "Take your time." He said, "You are not an arrangement. You have not been an arrangement since the carriage." He looked at the lamp flame rather than at her, which was perhaps the only way he could do it. I brought you into my house not knowing what I was doing, and what I have come to understand since is that I have not wanted to know my own house the way I have wanted to know what you think of it. I have not wanted to hear what any room is thinking the way I wanted to hear what you said that evening about the wind. He stopped, started again. I am telling you this now because my mother will not stop arranging dinners, and I am not willing to continue allowing the arrangement to speak for itself when speaking for it more clearly is entirely within my power. He looked at her. Will you be my wife? Not in the way the document says, in the way I mean it. She looked at him for long enough that I think, had I been him, I might not have survived it. Then she said, tear up the document. He said, it's already done. He reached into his coat pocket and laid on the ledge of the nearest frame a very serious ancestor in a very serious coat, 2 halves of a folded document, the solicitor's arrangement, already separated, already halved, already passed. She looked at the 2 halves. Then she looked at him, and the expression on her face was the one I had never seen there, not in the auction room or the dinner or the drawing room or the garden. The face that had been under all the composure, the one she had never let the world see because the world had not earned it. It was very young and very certain, and it was, unmistakably, joy. Yes, she said, I will be your wife. He did not do anything remarkable. He did not sweep her up or speak in poetry. He took her hand carefully, the way you take something you understand to be valuable, and held it and looked at her, and she looked back at him. And in the gallery with the serious ancestors and the cold and the low lamp burning, this was, I think, the most complete thing I have ever witnessed. They were married in April in the chapel on the grounds which Alara had asked for, and they married quietly, with the staff as witnesses and myself and the Reverend Ashby, and the dowager, who came because she was the Duke's mother and she had decided, I believe, though I never had her confidence on this, that she had always known he would do something unpredictable and that she might as well attend. She and Alara are not enemies. They have never been enemies. What they are now is something careful and not without respect, in the way of 2 people who have each discovered that the other is less easily dismissed than they had assumed. The document had been torn, as he said, on the morning of the day he spoke to her in the gallery. He had gone to his study at 7 in the morning and separated it and put it in his coat pocket, which means he had already decided, before the drawing room, before the arrival of Miss Pemberton, before the dowager's campaign had run another day. He had decided in his study at 7 o'clock, and then he had waited for the right moment to say it. He told me this himself, eventually, in one of the rare evenings we have had since his marriage, when we sat alone together and talked without purpose, the way brothers can when the years have been good. He said, I tore it before she was awake. I thought, if she did not wish to stay, she should be free to go, and I wanted to tell her so before she had spent another day in a situation she hadn't chosen. I said, and if she had chosen to go? He looked at the fire for a moment. Then she would have gone, he said, and I would have let her, and it would have been the worst thing that had ever happened to me. I believe him. I have never doubted it. I said I had told this story to no one. That is almost entirely true. I told it once to my own wife on a winter night some years after, when we lay in the dark and she asked me, out of nowhere, the way she asks things, what was the most certain I had ever been that love was real. Not love as an idea or a sentiment or a word used at weddings. Love as a fact, as a thing you could stand on. I told her about the auction room, about the girl walking in, about my brother going still, about £10,000 named without hesitation into a room full of men who had valued her at 1 sovereign. My wife was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he knew before she sat down, didn't he? I said, I believe so. She said, then it wasn't £10,000. It was the only thing he could think of to do with his hands. I have never found a better explanation. I have tried and I have not found one. The last time I was at Halvenmere was this past summer. The South Garden has been entirely redesigned, Alara's work, over several seasons, patient and intelligent and not remotely interested in doing it the way it had been done before. It is extraordinary. My brother walks through it with her in the evenings in a way that has nothing of the performance of matrimony and everything of the reality of it. Two people who are genuinely interested in the same piece of ground for reasons that are not entirely about the ground. She calls him by his name now, not his title, his name. I will not put it here. It is his to use, but the first time I heard her say it, passing him something at the breakfast table without ceremony, I felt something in the room shift. He looked up at her with an expression that said he had not known, until that moment, how long he had been waiting to be called by his name by someone who meant it. She was not sold to him. Whatever that document said, whatever the solicitor's careful language had named the arrangement, she was not sold to him. She was the woman who walked into a room where the world had priced her at less than nothing, and she sat down in the chair they had put in the middle of the room, and she looked at it all without flinching, every face, every sneer, every assumption. And my brother looked at her and understood, in whatever wordless and immediate way the best recognitions happen, that he had just seen the most valuable thing in the room. And he had done the only thing available to a man who understands the value of something. He had named his price for it, and his price was everything he had. He spent £10,000 to give her back her freedom. What she chose to do with it was love him. I am glad I stayed those 4 weeks. I am glad I was there for all of it. Some things you want to have seen with your own eyes so that when you tell them once properly to someone who deserves to hear it, you can say, I was there. It was real. It looked exactly like this.